Urbanisation. The United Nations predicts that people living in cities is around 50% now, and by 2030 that'll be 60%, and by 2050 that'll be 70%. In Bhutan, we have one of the highest urbanization rates in the world. In 1980, only 10% of the people in Bhutan lived in cities, and now it's almost 40%, and that's still going up. So 40% of the people living in Bhutan are living in cities. And this is interesting because at the same time we have statistics that show us that kind of 65 to 70% of the people are working in agriculture. If we look at these numbers, they don't actually add up because the people who are living in cities aren't still farming. And so we actually have kind of some catch up to do with what's happening, where's our food coming from. And so as we have that urbanization issue, it's not just the people in the cities consuming, it's also the lack of people in the rural areas producing. And producing in the rural areas, they're producing in a sustainable way. Cities around the world consume about 75% of resources. So that's quite interesting. They also generate about 70% of the carbon dioxide, the greenhouse gas emissions of the world. It's not entirely a bad thing because cities at the same time can be more resource efficient. So there's opportunities for efficiency. If we live in apartment buildings that are heated, we have neighbors above us and neighbors below us, and we can share the heat with them. So in some ways we can have increased efficiencies. If we have public transport systems, we can be more efficient. So there's ways that cities can be efficient, but that doesn't just happen by itself. That takes a concerted effort in design and in planning, and for the residents of cities to be aware of their environmental impact. Renewable resources. Bhutan's probably most famous renewable resource is going to be its trees. What's interesting about this is while Bhutan has in its constitution, and quite famously has in its constitution, the 60% forest cover for perpetuity, and estimates show that it has about 72% of the country covered in forests right now, there are still questions being asked about how sustainable that is, and whether a tree on the ground is always the same as another tree on the ground. So if we cut down trees that are this big and plant them with trees that are this big, I mean, the time that takes is 200 years, possibly more. And the question is, are we managing our forests with 200 years of thinking in our minds? And the reality is often not. It's difficult to do. I mean, as human beings, we can't imagine our great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren who are going to cut down this tree. We can barely imagine, what's going to happen tomorrow, what's going to happen with our children. So these are the concepts when we start thinking about sustainability. There's timescales that are very, very difficult for us. Now, water. Water in Bhutan is a very interesting issue. I was in a meeting with, I won't even say which one, with a joint secretary, and we were talking about water as an issue. And he said, water's not an issue here. We have water everywhere. And I said, well, we do have water everywhere right now, but will we have water everywhere forever? And what are we doing with that water? And how are we managing it? And where is it coming from and where is it going? We know a lot of it goes down rivers, it goes through hydro plants. But how long will those hydro plants last? Is there silt coming? Are they going to get blocked up? What are the other environmental consequences of making those dams? What about water for agriculture? Are our dams stealing it from our farmers? Are our farmers stealing it from our dams? It's not that one is right or one is wrong, but we don't really even know. And that's a challenge. And there's places in the country where they do have water issues. There's some places in the country where there's not enough water for their agriculture. There's places where the paddy is changing to be dry land, and we have to change our agriculture habits associated with that. So we also have to remember that water is in everything that we have. If we think about water, water is in our energy supply, and we know that here because we have hydroelectricity. Water is in our crops and our vegetables that we eat because we know that they grow, but water is in that cell phone that you have. Water is in that phone because it's used in the process. When we make plastics, we use water. When we make metals, we use water. When we mine coal or make cement, we use water. And all those things have a water impact. And so we have to be able to recognize, again, looking at the whole value chain, where does something come from? Where does it go? How much water is used along the way? When we wash our clothes, there's a lot of water there. And where is that water going after we wash with it? What are the pollutants that we're putting in with it, with the soap and everything else? So these are important things to keep in mind. Water is not free. We have to remember that. It comes with a cost, and whether we share that cost with each other or whether we're borrowing that cost from the future is something that we need to consider. Now, what about waste? We need to move from a linear production system, one that's a linear value chain where we take things out of the ground, we use them, and then we throw them away. And sometimes here in Bhutan it's on the side of the road or in a river, and sometimes we have Greener Way that's there to collect it for us, which is very nice. Yeah, but there are ways that we can use things here. First of all, more than half of the waste that goes into the system here in Bhutan is organic waste. And so when we all used to live in the countryside, that was pretty easy because we just threw that in our back garden, and by spring we would have some nice dirt and we would fertilize our fields with it. But now that we live in cities, we don't necessarily have gardens, so we put it in that little convenient bucket and then it just kind of disappears and we don't think about it anymore. But where does that go? Does it fill up a hole up above Thimphu where we have kind of overflowing? Are there other things that we can do with it? So we need to think about where our waste goes and what can be done with that. And so recycling rates are something that's quite important. Currently very low in Bhutan. And then in Europe, they're at about 45%. But what's interesting is that in India, they're actually higher than that. And the reason that they're higher in that is that they provide employment opportunities for the poorest people in India. There's people who make a living picking through trash. And because there's a price on this trash, it makes it worth it for them. If they find a single piece of copper or a single aluminum can, that is worth something. And that's worth something which makes it worthwhile for them to collect it. In Bhutan, each of these bottles, the PET bottles that we have here, these are actually worth something. But the problem is they're worth so little that if it's on the side of the road, it's 1/10 of 1 miltrum, which means that it's not really worth our while to stop, go over, and pick it up. If it was worth 100 miltrum and it was lying there on the side of the road, you can bet it would be picked up. I'd pick it up. But we have to look at what is the cost that we're placing on these things, how we can create a value for these materials, because they are worth something. But sometimes they're worth more than just the plastic. They're worth also the avoided cost that we put on the environment. And that's something that we need to consider.